Tonight on Nation to Nation, NDP MP Nathan Cullen is disappointed the federal government has ignored the confrontation between the Wet'suwet'en and RCMP.
That's why the pain is so sharp when the Wet'suwet'en standing on their land are being forcibly removed and can't get the ear of the federal government.
Cindy Blackstock was back at a human rights tribunal on child welfare because Ottawa won't apply Jordan's principle to critically ill, non-status children.
That's not good enough for me. If you or I saw a child in urgent need across the street from us, we wouldn't just keep on walking. We'd go over there and do what we can to help.
And a big court win for signatories of the 1850 Robinson-Huron Treaty in Ontario. A judge ruled their $4 a year annuity should be increased.
Because in the treaty it says that the annuity ought to be increased if the government gains more revenue in a territory.
I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. The clash between the RCMP and the opponents of a natural gas pipeline has been going on all week in northern British Columbia. The area in question falls within the federal riding of Skeena-Bulkley Valley. It's represented by NDP MP Nathan Cullen. Prior to the RCMP enforcing the court injunction obtained by Coastal GasLinks, Cullen talked to all sides and issued a short statement on social media urging continued dialogue and a peaceful resolution. Joining me now from Smithers, BC is Nathan Cullen. Mr. Cullen, welcome to Nation.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So, Mr. Cullen, considering what's happened, are we past the point of a peaceful resolution?
Oh, no, I think we always remain hopeful that the sides which are talking, we're talking all of yesterday, well, particularly between the RCMP and the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, as to how to not have happen again. I think the way things were handled earlier in the week was not appropriate in any kind of way. And the Wet'suwet'en, talking to a number of the elders, because there was a great number of people at the blockade who were quite elderly, the use of, I don't want to say the use of force, but certainly the size of the force that was brought to bear, the types of arms that the RCMP brought in, assault weapons and paramilitary type of approach, was not in keeping with what we're trying to do here, which is have respectful dialogue over what is a legitimate concern over a territory that the Wet'suwet'en rightfully claim under the law.
You also called on the federal government to engage with the Wet'suwet'en. What can the feds do at this point? Especially this is, unlike the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, this does not cross provincial boundaries.
Oh, well, two things. One is the Parliament of Canada just a few months ago passed the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, led by my colleague, Romeo Saganash. Mr. Trudeau, of course, voted for that along with his government. And in that declaration are a number of detailed rights that the government of Canada must now seek to implement. So you can't vote for something in theory but not its practice. That appears to this point to be what Mr. Trudeau has done. He's in British Columbia today. He certainly stood on the stage and congratulated himself when the pipeline deal was announced. It's a very large investment, the largest project in Canadian history. And so you can't just show up for the popping of the champagne corks. There's a whole bunch of work if he wants to see this through. And he is, as your show has pointed out and many others, has said many times that there's no relationship more important to him than that with the Indigenous peoples of this country. So these are two top priorities for the Prime Minister. He's in the province. He needs to start to engage with the Wet'suwet'en and bring to bear the influence and the force of the federal government, not in a negative way, but in a way that is respectful of rights and title. This is the place of Delgamuukw Gisdaywa. This is the place and the people who fought to the Supreme Court and won the right to have their traditions respected. And so that's why the pain is so sharp when the Wet'suwet'en standing on their land are being forcibly removed and can't get the ear of the federal government, which is very unfortunate.
Now, in the past, you've differentiated this project from Trans Mountain, especially in the effort to engage First Nations. Do you feel Coastal GasLink did enough consultation especially regarding the events that have just occurred?
Yeah, it seems that the company's focus was primarily on the elected chief and band councils. They signed what are called impact benefit agreements, which often, and I think it's true in this case, stipulate that when a band council signs on to the agreement, it doesn't mean they endorse the project. It just means what terms the project will happen under. it's unfortunate. Governments and companies do this all the time. They then take those agreements, which again are signed just by the band council level, which don't have authority over the land base. In Wet'suwet'en culture, that authority is given to the hereditary chiefs. The company may have done some outreach, but according to the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en, they don't feel like the company has truly engaged them at all. And this is why this whole discussion might end up in court in front of a judge trying to ascertain whether meaningful consultation by the government or by the company was actually done with the hereditary leadership of the Wet'suwet'en. I'm not giving advice, and I'm not saying that's for sure, but it seems one of the possible outcomes, and it would actually be a more peaceful outcome than enforcing injunctions, conflict on the line, and the potential for people to get hurt.
It certainly sounds like it's going to be a hot-button issue for a while in your riding. I guess when you go to a campaign in just a few months, I suppose, what are you going to tell people you're going to be asking to vote for you about this particular issue? Especially if they ask, ask you if you support it or not.
Right. So this is the issue that we've been facing, not over this project, over many, because of course we're in a resource-rich part of the world. There has been mines and all sorts of very large-scale projects that have been proposed. Some of them have gone ahead, and they've gone ahead because they've been able to do consultation and accommodation of the Indigenous peoples properly. This one has done a large amount of that, but has missed or been unable to do it with one piece of the project. This is the new reality in Canada. This has, I believe, been a long time coming. I can only imagine how Indigenous leaders feel about that. But that in order to have certainty on the ground, in order to get any project of scale done, we need to have a new way of talking to each other and a new way of establishing consent. Because the approach that was taken by the federal government, by the proponent in this case, is clearly not up to muster. A court will probably determine that. In terms of my support or not a support of the project, my feeling is that self-determination and my belief in that means if the First Nations come forward, are able to sign agreements that they're satisfied with, that it protects the environment, then a project should go ahead. If it doesn't, then it can't. And that's not me talking, that's the Supreme Court of Canada and a whole bunch of other authorities talking as well.
You mentioned this is one piece of a bigger pie. I suppose, is it fair to the rest of the pie that this one piece is holding up the whole project, though?
Well, isn't that the question, though, right, that we're grappling with right now? That we believe in rights and title. So if you have, just take two First Nations, never mind the dozen or 15 or so that are involved with this project, if one is saying yes and one is saying no, if the government is on the yes side, if the proponent wants to see this through, it seems to me that we have courts for a reason. The government and the company would have to say, we're going to infringe on somebody's title. Who is saying no? And convince a court that it's in the broader interest of all the people involved. And if they are going to infringe on that rights and title, then the conversation becomes about accommodating, of repairing the damage that the government admits it's going to do to somebody's territory. That seems to me one possible course. Now, I'm not guiding the Wet'suwet'en. I'm not telling them what to do. I'm working on the federal government side of things, and they need to start proposing some solutions that don't just involve RCMP enforcement at a blockade. They have to get a lot more creative and a lot more respectful than that in Ottawa. And so far, it's been difficult to engage the Prime Minister and his cabinet fully.
Okay, on that note, Mr. Cullen, I want to thank you for taking some time to talk to me.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
After the break, a human rights tribunal on First Nations child welfare is up and running again. Cindy Blackstock will tell us the latest. Welcome back. A human rights tribunal on First Nations child welfare heard arguments again on Wednesday. First Nations Child and Family Caring Society is asking for immediate relief for a non-status toddler because the 20-month-old child has been denied medical treatment under Jordan's principle, which states that medical services need to be dealt with even in the event of a jurisdictional dispute between the province and the federal government. Caring Society's executive director is Cindy Blackstock, and she joins me now. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
Now, just briefly, tell me a bit about the medical condition that this toddler is going under, because I know it was the center of yesterday's tribunal.
It was. And I think what's really clear is to know that we were asking a motion, an interim motion, for non-status children who have urgent care needs to be covered under Jordan's principle until the definition of the tribunal's order of all First Nations children can be dealt with. That's all we wanted. Canada was opposed to it. And in this particular case that we're using as an example to say that this needs to be done, we had a 20-month-old child who had a very rare medical condition that was life-threatening. And she required a medical intervention, a diagnostic service that was considered to be essential by the medical team. And Canada refused the $4,600 it would take to get her from Toronto to Stollery Hospital, where that medical treatment was provided. And they dragged it out. They didn't tell the mom right away. They dragged it out to such a time that they only denied the claim really officially in terms of letting the people know at the community level that this wasn't going to go ahead 2 days before the scan. So the Caring Society paid for the scan. But we can't be relied upon to pay for everybody because we're not in that kind of business. But we're saying to the tribunal, any non-status child who is a member of or recognized by their First Nation as a member and who is First Nations themselves should be covered under Jordan's principle. I can't believe that we're arguing this about life-threatening situations. And
so I just want to be clear, this is about a non-status child that's recognized because, of course, non-status traditionally have been under provincial care.
Right. So this is a non-status child whose parents are mother is First Nations and grandmother is First Nations and are members of the community. And Canada's still saying no. So Indigenous Services, of course, has repeatedly stated that no child has gone on without care under Jordan's principle in the last year or so, whenever Minister Philpott was appointed. So I guess what's the difference in this case then? Is it just because of the status, non-status thing? That's the only thing that they'll say. And they have no other thing in a denial letter other than this child is non-status. That's not good enough for me. If you or I saw a child in urgent need across the street from us, we wouldn't just keep on walking, right? We'd go over there and do what we can to help as citizens. What Canada wants to do is they say, oh, hey, do you need any help? But if it costs us any money, we're going to keep on walking. And even if we know you won't get the care otherwise. I think that's wrong.
Now, the child is non-status, and, you know, shouldn't the province automatically be stepping in to cover this care anyways?
You would think so, but this is such a rare condition that there wasn't a policy of payment that would allow for that. And it was such an essential issue, and Canada left it so long to deny it, that really there wasn't enough time to be messing around with the province. You know, like we had to just make sure it prioritized her best needs first. This is a young First Nations toddler who required diagnostic treatment for a life-threatening condition. To me, that's all I needed to know.
I suppose why is this issue, you know, of course, the Daniels decision came out. Federal government is supposed to treat non-status like status. So if we have the Daniels decision out there, why are we in this
I think
position?
That's a question to ask the government of Canada. Like, they found their arguments today completely unconvincing. And they were all like the old mindset. They were all about them, about unfairness that might happen to them, or about some theoretical thing or some political thing. But they had no answer about what to do for this child or for other children like her. And, you know, in general, we have seen some real progress under Minister Philpott, and I was grateful for that. But things have really stalled since about August. And we now have 23 other items that we need to litigate in front of the tribunal. And the government is refusing to mediate these issues. So it's like they want to go to court. So unfortunately, that's where we're going to go, is to the tribunal.
Because my understanding was that the tribunal was supposed to wind down this spring, wasn't it?
It's supposed to wind down this spring, but I don't think that's probably going to happen because there's so many of these big issues, and they're cropping up with more frequency than we've seen before.
Now, the Assembly of First Nations released a statement just a few days ago. They agree in part with your effort to get immediate relief, but their concern is that they want a full hearing to determine what orders like this will do to override First Nations rights, especially around citizenship. Where do you stand on that statement from them?
My view is that, you know, First Nations have the rights to be able to determine their own citizens. But this is a very narrow order about who's included in Jordan's principle. And we're talking about little kids here, right? You know, one of the founding values of First Nations is that children are sacred. Not just our First Nations kid, but every kid. And I think we should be standing up and demanding that all levels of government make sure every child especially children who identify as First Nations, but not exclusively. All children who have life-threatening or irremediable harm, and there's some service that they could get help, I say give it to them.
Now, in that statement as well, they wanted a full hearing to hear the whole thing, and that in the meantime, they want to, if these cases come up, they want it as a case-by-case basis. Are you okay with that, or do you want you don't want to have to go through this?
I don't want to go through this because these are kids by definition who are in urgent need. That means time is of the essence. If there is going to be a fault on one side or the other, I'd rather it be in the favor of the child's safety. That's all the way I've operated. So I would rather see that just all of these children who are First Nations, who are non-status op reserve, get the urgent care that they require. I think that's a duty we owe them as a society, and I think that's the duty the Government of Canada definitely owes them.
Now, of course, after the meeting yesterday, you had an in-camera meeting in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Was anything decided, such as an order for this toddler?
No, we're still waiting on the order, and we will be setting down dates beginning as early as February to deal with the other issues. And my hope is that the Government of Canada, goes back to being actually sitting at the table and resolving these things in the best interest of kids, instead of pulling out all these technicalities from the old toolkit it used over those 12 years we were litigating. It's been 12 years we've been at the tribunal. So imagine that. That's a time frame from when a child was just going into grade 1, they're graduating this year, and we're still litigating about whether First Nations kids deserve equal treatment.
Well, I'm surprised that, because as I said earlier, I thought this was winding down. But I have to wind down the interview, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Ms. Blackstock, once again, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, it was a great Christmas present for nearly 24 First Nations in Ontario. I'll tell you why when we come back. Welcome back. Over the holidays, the First Nations who signed the 1850 Robinson-Huron treaties got a bit of a Christmas present. Justice Patricia Hennessy ruled in their favor in a court case, basically saying their $4 a year treaty annuity should have been periodically adjusted. That could mean a big raise in what approximately 30,000 people and 21 First Nations receive every year. To talk more about it, I'm joined by Mike Restoule. He's the chair of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Litigation Committee. Mr. Restoule, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you, Todd. It's nice to be with you.
So how big of a win is this for you and your communities?
Well, it's a pretty huge win because we've been at this case for a long time and spent a lot of money getting to where we are today. So we're pretty pleased about it, and it represents a huge win for us.
You told APTN News in the past that this judgment would be a positive step toward a nation-to-nation relationship. How so?
Well, the treaty speaks of sharing the benefits from the land, and that's what the bargain was in 1850. But since about 1874, the Crown has only increased the annuity to $4 per person, and since that time, the government, both governments, Canada and Ontario, have made a lot of money in the territory, which was not shared with the First Nations. So that was the basis of the treaty, is sharing of the land. That's our relationship.
So, of course, you can plug in any kind of amount into an inflation calculator on the internet, and I plugged $4 into one, and it came out to $170 Canadian. Is that kind of the annual dollar figure you're looking at now?
We have no idea at this point, because what we've done in the court cases, we've asked the Crown governments to do a study on how much revenue was gained in the territory since the 1870s, and we haven't gotten any feedback from the governments on that as yet. So that's a starting point. Once we know that, then we'll know how we should develop a sharing protocol.
Is this just about increasing the annuity, or is there anything else involved, like land or resource revenue sharing?
When we talked about that, because the treaty involves the land, a connection to the land, and use by the federal and provincial governments. If we talk about everything, forestry, mining, navigation, all of these kinds of things, if we talk about that in some sort of a settlement, it's way too large for a court case. So that's why when we talk about how we're going to bring our case to the court, we zeroed in purely on the annuity, because in the treaty it says that the annuity ought to be increased if the government gains more revenue in a territory.
What about asking for, I suppose, compensation? You say that it hasn't been raised since 1874. Is that also going to be part of the conversation?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, because once the revenue has been determined by the government, some sort of calculation as to how much annuity, how much the annuity would be increased as a result of that.
So what's next, I suppose, as far as negotiating some type of settlement? Have you set a date to sit down with the government yet?
What we've done, Todd, is we've sent letters to Prime Minister Trudeau and to Premier Ford to ask them to set up a mandate for some officials to sit down at a table with us to discuss the possibility of some settlement action.
I suppose, how soon do you think the people in your communities can expect a raise then?
Well, we're not sure because, it all depends on how the settlement negotiations wind up and what conditions are on those on any funding that's coming from that.
Is there any particular figure that you'd like to see that people get every year? I don't have any idea. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an economist, and I don't have any idea. I just know that, I'm aware that the governments have gained a lot of revenue since the 1800s, and we didn't get a proper share of that. So we need to talk about that and find out how we're going to look at increasing the annuity. Of course, you said you're not a lawyer, but can you predict, I suppose, if this could affect the annuities that First Nations on the prairies, for example, get? They get a nice, crisp $5 bill every year.
That's right. I don't know. Perhaps, they would be able to put together a case to have their annuities increased. I'm not sure. It all depends on how this ruling by Justice Hennessy impacts other treaties. But, I'm not a lawyer and I can't speak to those kinds of things.
Well, Mr. Restoule, thank you for talking to me and enjoy this win in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Todd, for having me on your show.
That's all we have for this week. But if you missed any part of tonight's show or any previous show, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.